I am accused of the plotting attempt to overthrow the legitimate government of Belarus because I was calling for sanctions against the Lukashenko regime.
I'm Benjamin Wittes, and this is the Lawfare Podcast. Today we're talking to Katsiaryna Shmatsina about her ongoing criminal trial in Belarus for trying to overthrow the constitutional order. I
knew that some of my colleagues, like economists, some of them were approached at a certain point by KGB guys, and just they would have a friendly conversation, like, yeah, you just what you're doing. We're not targeting you at the moment.
All right, so I have never had on the Lawfare Podcast before an actual criminal, much less somebody who is accused of a January 6th-like conspiracy to overthrow the constitutional order of her republic. So I want to start by just asking you who you are and what you are accused of.
Hi, Ben. I am a Belarusian foreign policy analyst, interestingly enough. And I am accused of, the plotting attempt to overthrow the legitimate government of Belarus and posing a threat to national security because I was calling for sanctions against the Lukashenko regime, and a few other articles. I don't even remember the exact formulations, but it's something along the lines of hate speech or something like that. And I don't even know what that means.
So was the hate speech, hang Mike Pence, or?
The hate speech was probably along the lines that it's not okay that the regime of Lukashenko is beating up people, the protesters on the streets, or maybe it's not okay to allow uncontrollable Russian disinformation in Belarusian media space.
I see. So was there a riot? Did you storm the Belarusian capital?
Not really. Funny enough, I did not even participate in the peaceful protests in Belarus because I was just spending back in the days of the presidential elections 2020, which was what divided, I would say, the country, and before and after.
Just like here? See?
So I was just writing articles and commenting on the presidential campaign in Belarus from my home and using open sources. But look where it brought me.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. I've been joking and making light of it, but in fact, you are actually currently on trial.
So far, I think there is a third hearing scheduled in the Minsk Regional Court, and there are 20 defendants in the case, including myself. All of us are political analysts. Some are political analysts, my colleagues. Some are journalists, and even some Democratic opposition politicians. And we were somehow grouped in the single case, and the prosecutors decided that we were all coordinating and plotting against the legitimate government in Belarus.
So we're going to, for those listeners who don't know anything about Belarusian politics, we're going to come back and do a little bit of a primer on that. But before we do, just to set it up, how is this trial taking place? And you're sitting here in my studio. You're not locked up. You're not in court. What are you doing here? Why aren't you, in Minsk in the regional court facing trial?
I chose to flee Minsk back in 2020 during the presidential elections because I felt that it was no longer safe for me to stay in my hometown. I saw people I worked with getting arrested, journalists beaten up and dragged into detention on sort of fabricated charges. And I saw for instance, a fellow political analyst being dragged at 2 a.m. in the morning into KGB prison for possibly like being affiliated with George Washington University in D.C., where he was working on his PhD. And he also published an article about Armenian protests and comparing them to the Belarusian case. And the government decided, apparently, like the Belarusian government decided to maybe to show that the evil Americans stand behind every protest that happens in Belarus when Lukashenko happens to sort of re-elect himself every once in a while. And right now, like this year marks exactly 30 years of him staying in in the presidential office. Looking at all these detentions, I figured that, okay, maybe I don't want to take my chances and I would be safer abroad. And for past couple of years, I lived in Europe, and then I moved to D.C. to work on my PhD dissertation here in D.C.
All right. So the trial is taking place without you.
Yes.
And I take it without the other 19 of your co-defendants as well?
Luckily, yes. So none of us are in Belarus, and we don't know much details of the case. We are not in touch with any of our lawyers. So again, ironically enough—
Wait, let's pause over that, because this is lawfare.
Right. Okay.
You know, when we think of a trial, we think, you know, that the defendant has lawyers. Tell me about your
We do
lawyers.
have our lawyers.
Yeah,
There are 20 of us. Each of us has a lawyer assigned by state.
Right. So
For free.
For free.
Amazing.
Have you ever met your lawyer?
No, I don't even know who my lawyer is.
I see. Have you ever had any communication with your lawyer about what the charges are or how you want to defend yourself?
No, because I didn't really want to waste time because my colleagues already tried, like a couple of my colleagues who are in the same case, they tried to contact their lawyers. They called them, they sent emails, they did not get any response. And the lawyers are the only ones besides the judge and the prosecutor who have access to the case materials. And for me, I think, like, I just didn't want to maybe attract more like unwanted attention to my case. Well, because I was sort of caring about the safety of those who I'm still sort of related to, people who are still maybe some like relatives. People who are still in Belarus. And I mean that even sending a request to the Belarusian state officials while you're a dissident abroad, it's not the best choice you could make. Because you remind of your existence once more, and it could have consequences for those who are still in touch with you inside the country.
So you mentioned the KGB, which sounds like a bit of a throwback. What is the Belarusian KGB?
So when I mention KGB, people would usually say, like, oh, did you mean, like, that's the Soviet name? What's the actual current name, right? And I'm saying, like, well, that's the actual name, and we still have this Stelling Times building in the city center. And while in places like Lithuania, this dark KGB premises turned into a museum of the repressions, in Belarus it's a fully functional institution.
And it just never bothered to change its name.
It seems like the folks who run this security apparatus, they're actually proud of their history. And most recently, by the way, they named like the best lyceum in the country of the Belarusian that is affiliated, essentially like the high school, elite high school affiliated with Belarusian State University, was named after Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was like the founder.
Yes. Had a different name then. I guess it was
Cheka. Yeah.
But so, yeah, for those who KGB is a Russian acronym for State Security Services. And I think Belarus is the only country that still has a KGB named KGB, right?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I mean, in Russia, it changed its name to the FSB and SVR in the 90s sometime. So, all right. You don't seem like an insurrectionist. When I think of
I think I'm pretty useless in that role.
when I think of insurrectionists, I think of like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, and I don't think of a foreign policy analyst. How did you come to be a indicted criminal on basically seditious conspiracy charges? Like, what did you do that angered them?
I happened to choose the wrong profession, which is being a political analyst, independent researcher who dares to comment on Belarusian foreign policy or domestic politics and who is not affiliated with the regime. And I've been doing this work for quite a few years. During the times when Lukashenko was pretending to be a reliable guy in the eyes of the West, and I mean the times of normalizations of relations with the West, when, especially after the Crimea annexation happened, he managed to promote his image to the European and American policymakers that, okay, now I'm not the worst guy in the room. We're the country, like the important puzzle in the regional stability, etc. And then, so during those times, we, the expert community, the independent, non-pro-governmental ones, were still speaking up about the human rights violations or the intimidation of the democratic opposition, some preemptive arrests before even, let's say, they were happening before something as maybe seemingly insignificant as local elections or parliamentary elections. There were some preemptive arrests of the most visible political figures who were opposing the regime. And we were speaking up about those uncomfortable sort of truth. While, let's say, the regime was promoting promoting some pro-regime analysts who would travel to DC, shake hands here, or hire some lobbyists on the Hill to say, like, oh, hey, let's not focus on those past days where Lukashenko happened to stand behind the disappearance of political opponents who were later found dead. Like it was a long time ago, like in the 90s. Right now, we're doing okay. Russia is behind us. Like Russia is more dangerous actor in the room. So let's just focus on maybe releasing some sanction relief or restoring full-fledged diplomatic ties in the case of U.S. and Belarus. And again, like we as an expert community, independent one, we were just this uncomfortable actor who was standing against those like repression attempts. But we were relatively safe at the time. We knew we were monitored. I knew that something as simple as just receiving honorarium for an op-ed could drag an unwanted attention from KGB, for instance. And the institution where I used to be a fellow, the Belarusian Institute for Strategic Studies, we didn't have our office. And it was not uncommon when someone from nonprofits, civil society actors, or researchers, they could not register and operate in Belarus. It was simply dangerous. And by the way, Elias Bilatsky, who is the human rights defender, founder of the oldest human rights group in Belarus, and also Nobel Prize laureate, he's now behind the bars for the second time for whatever they charged him with now. But a couple of years ago, during the times of normalizations, when everything seemed okay and Lukashenko was not as sort of dangerous as he is now, he put Belarusian behind the bars exactly for sort of providing funding to the human rights group. So it was simply not safe even to operate in Belarus, to register as a legal entity in Belarus. And so long story short, after 2020, it became even more dangerous to continue the work, to even publish an op-ed using open sources when you criticize the regime.
All right, so let's talk about the regime. You've mentioned Lukashenko several times. For those who have never focused on him, who is he? Give us a little primer on the post-Soviet Belarusian regime.
So we Belarusians happened to have our only democratic elections after the collapse of Soviet Union in 1994, and Alexander Lukashenko, was the one who won at those elections, and he managed to stay in power again, like for next 30 years, and he still remains in his office. He started as, I think, he was managing or like the head of a collective farm. He was serving in the army, and then he also expressed some interest in politics at some point in the early 90s. He even was at the anti-corruption committee at the Belarusian parliament at the time, or the council, whatever the name was at the time. And I also happen to know maybe relatives or other or relatives of the people who were supporting him at the time, or some experts who served as consultants in his campaign. And that personal touch or some witness maybe or personal impressions give an additional touch to understand like what kind of personality this guy has. And he ran on the way he was appealing to the population, the way he managed to win over like the hearts of Belarusians in the 90s was to run on the populist agenda to say that, okay, like the Soviet Union collapsed, the economy is in disarray, I'm the good guy, like I will promise you something I would never be able to fulfill. But at the times when like Belarus was trying to maybe restore or like construct the new like state institutions after gaining independence, it seems like it was appealing to the population. And so what people who were supporting him, like genuinely supporting him, like the economists who were writing his program for him or some like speeches for him, they were saying like, we actually believed that he was like Lech Walesa in Belarus, as someone who genuinely, like a very simple guy who comes from village, from middle of nowhere, who is very passionate about his country, very down to earth, and he should be like, it feels like we could trust him. And ironically, again, like one of the examples, like there was a diplomat at the time who supported him, and he was even supporting him financially at a certain point, like maybe helping him like to get dressed well when he was appearing at public debate. But later, this diplomat ended up in the opposition to Lukashenko, ended up, his name is Mikhail Marinich, I think. And he ended up in jail while he was opposing Lukashenko. And then there his health was deteriorated to the extent that, I mean, he was released from prison because he was no longer a threat. And it gives all sorts of allusions now to the case of Navalny, for example. Mm-hmm. So that's who, like, Lukashenko was at the early times. He was charming, he has charisma, he's not a dumb guy. He's not highly sophisticated, but he's a good, cunning, like, politician who is doing well, like, sort of playing on the geopolitical sentiments of Putin, and we can touch on that later.
Yeah, so one of the hallmarks of his regime, other than violent repression of his opposition, has been the very public policy of kind of unity with Russia. And this is quite different from other European countries which have this, push-pull between, in Ukraine's case, Yanukovych, who has a kind of desire to be closer to Putin, but then the pull toward Europe. Belarus seems, or Lukashenko's regime seems desiring of being as close to Russia as possible. Talk about that. Is he a Putin? He's been there longer than Putin. Is he an agent of Putin, a puppet of Putin, or is he his own actor?
So speaking of why did this Russification or Russian-Belarusian union state integration happen in the early 90s, there are several reasons to that. One is that Lukashenko just genuinely hates the Belarusian culture and language.
And just to, for those who, that sounds like a weird thing to say about your own country, Belarus has a language that is historically repressed by the Soviet Union.
And the Russian Empire.
And the Russian Empire before it. And there is a kind of long-term effort to Russify Belarus. So when you say hates Belarusian culture, you mean non-Russified, right? Thinks of it as a kind of outpost of Russian culture, yeah?
I guess. But also, I think it stems from the conflict that Lukashenko had with other political groups of that time. The political groups that were trying to preserve or restore Belarusian culture and language, among other priorities on their agenda. And here I mean the Belarusian Popular Front or other political parties or groups that were anti-Soviet at the times of collapse of Soviet Union. And they were also present in the parliament at that time when Lukashenko was competing for power. And they spotted right away his authoritarian tendencies. Lukashenko came to power in 1994. In 1995, he started to consolidate power in a way that, for instance, there were a group of members of parliament who were opposing some of his decisions. I think it was also on providing the Russian language the second official language status. And the way he dealt with opponents was just to order the police or special forces to just kick out from the parliament the members of the parliament. And that was a very early sign of his matters of dealing with
never
opponents.
A good sign.
Yes.
So most people in Belarus, are they Belarusian speaking? Are they Russian speaking, or both?
Right now you would just see Russian language predominantly present everywhere.
And that's a reflection of Lukashenko's.
Let me put it that way. So there is no higher education institution where you can actually receive education in Belarusian language. There are virtually very few schools left that provide education in Belarusian language. And it happens because the notion of using Belarusian language and identity is politicized, and it almost automatically indicates that you are anti-regime.
And does it have the same pro-Western quality as, Ukrainian orientation does in Ukraine, or is it its own thing?
What do you mean by that?
So I associate, people who are insistent on Ukrainian language tend to be Western-oriented people who are...
Those are the people who tend to remember or that if you look even at the 300 years of Belarusian history and Belarus-Russia relations, they would calculate that out of those 300 years, 70 years, we were at war with Russia in one form or another, while the official propaganda and the school history books would tell you that we've been friends and brothers and sisters all along, and no conflicts whatsoever.
And so is your impression of Lukashenko that he is he's Russified himself? I think he doesn't speak Belarusian.
Oh, he doesn't. He barely can read it from paper.
He is, he's oriented toward Russia as sort of the big brother in the Slavic Brotherhood, and therefore he opposes symbols of Belarusian nationalism and kind of independence. Or is it the opposite, that his political opponents were Belarusian nationalists, and he therefore opposes them and everything they represent?
Yeah.
Which is cause and which is effect?
My take on it is that it was because those Belarusian nationalists did not accept him and they were opposing his autocratic tendencies early on. And then there is another interesting observation, which could seem really foolish and funny right now. But back in the 90s, when Yeltsin was in power, so Putin's predecessor, Lukashenko was on a good he was sort of buddies with Yeltsin at the time, and he was even considering himself that he could, once Yeltsin steps when Yeltsin steps out of power, Lukashenko was actually. He thought that there was a window of opportunities for him to
take over the whole
thing, and that's why he was pushing forward the Union state integration.
Yeah, I mean, he had one problem, which is that he wasn't part of the same country
Right.
anymore. And if you could fix that, right, you could be the natural successor.
Yes.
And that sounds completely nuts in retrospect, but it wasn't so nuts in like 1998 or 1999. And until Putin showed up, there were all kinds of contenders for who was going to succeed Yeltsin. I mean,
So you alluded
guy
to the
Alexander
2020 election.
Libed, right?
Yeah,
There were
or
all
Nemtsov or-
there were all
Crackdown
these
that
followed that.
like,
Tell us what happened
weird
in
regional
2020
governors
and how
and
it
stuff.
came
And
to
so
affect
Belarus
you personally.
President wasn't the
What
craziest.
happened in 2020 has not happened
All right,
before.
so
And let me explain and elaborate is that I've seen protest major crackdowns on the opposition before. And to name a few, it was 2006, major protests during the elections, presidential elections, where once again the people, Belarusians could see how their votes were, vote count falsified, and not only that, but the front runners of the race put in jail, right? And 2010, same thing happened. 600 people detained. There was blood on the streets as a consequences of a brutal crackdown on the peaceful demonstrations.
and these were peaceful demonstrations following an election that Lukashenko quite clearly lost,
Yes.
but then stole.
Yes. And then Lukashenko happens to give himself
Did they
around-
use the slogan "Stop the Steal"?
I'm not sure. But Lukashenko keeps re-electing himself with something along the lines like 80 to maybe 87-ish% of votes. Once he publicly admitted even that he falsified the elections, he said I got more votes, but then I saw that the opposition got very few, and I knew that I will be very upset. So I told the Electoral Commission, give them a few more votes.
Excellent.
Yes. And so when people just gather on the streets following this vote count, that doesn't feel right to them. Usually, all the front runners end up in jail, either before the election day or right on the election day. Some of them are tortured and then released. Some of them remain longer behind the bars. So that was like a usual sort of procedure. And usually we have this like group of martyrs or crazy idealists who still, knowing all these realities, they would still say, okay, I'm running for elections this time because I feel like, well, there should be some alternative, or maybe we should try to change this with like peaceful means or to show the scale of injustice. 2015 elections were surprisingly peaceful. That was the time of normalization of relations with the West again, when everyone is shaking hands with Lukashenko because he seemed like a more reliable guy than Putin. That was the time when, like the opposition, I think they just did not participate that much in the elections. But the protest mood and discontent was still boiling in the society, and it got it reached the point of no return in 2020. We had a couple of frontrunners, among them Viktor Babaryka, for instance, or Sergei Tikhanovsky, who were detained and put in jail during the presidential campaign. I think they were not even allowed to register as candidates because they were detected early on as a threat, right? So they were put behind the bars, and the opposition managed to sort of consolidate and to choose one candidate, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and I assume that our audience have heard her name one way or another because she's quite visible right now on political arena. And at that time, there was maybe some idealism on behalf of the presidential candidates, particularly Viktor Babaryka and his team. They were literally like idealistically thinking, okay, we will use only the legal means, we will stay in the legal field. There is no way that if everyone shows up at the polling station, that the regime could falsify like the election results, or if we just show up on the street, that they would beat us for doing nothing. It almost like they forgot what was happening before. But it happened again, and the arrests and what happened. Something was very new and dramatic. Was that there were people killed on the streets in the first days of the protest. Before that, people were just beaten badly and put in jail. But there, in 2020, we actually saw like how an clearly unarmed protester who was even like holding his hands above his head, showing that he's unarmed, and he was trying to approach the police. He was just shot on the street. On the day of the vote count, there were a few protest-related deaths, and one of them is the head of local commission who denied to sign the protocols, the fraudulent protocols from the polling station. And so he was just found dead somewhere in a swamp or in the woods, middle of nowhere. So there were like a few quite disturbing stories like that hasn't ever happened in Belarusian contemporary history. And that was in a way like point of no return.
But you were not in the streets. You were...
Because I remembered what was happening in the previous 10 years ago, right?
Right, but you were at home
right.
Writing reports for the German Marshall Fund.
And Kennan Institute.
And the Kennan Institute. You
were the evil
being a good think tanker. Why come after you?
I mean,
like when I think of like the most dangerous people in a society, I mean, with all due respect to my Brookings colleagues, it's not us. We're we're not the scariest people. The people out in the streets are much more dangerous.
That was part of my that was the rationale for me staying at home, because I knew that I honestly don't have the stamina to go through detention, and there were multiple reports of tortures, rapes, like up to the beating up to the point of like internal bleeding, etc. And I just knew that I don't have the courage to pay this price potentially. And I didn't. It's not that someone told me in the broad daylight, like, "Hi, Katya, like we are watching you," or like, "We will arrest you tomorrow." I just was having a bunch of sort of mixed signals, knowing that like they were looking very suspicious. It didn't look good to me.
Right. So what's a signal that you get that's not some guy with a trench coat coming up to you and saying, "Hi, Katya, I'm from the KGB. You're in trouble." What's a signal in Minsk that maybe it's time to leave?
When I saw that the KGB and the police are coming after journalists.
So it's arrests of other people.
Arrest of people whom I knew well, and with whom, for instance, a couple of days before the elections, we would sit in a cafe and chat, or we would write a piece together. That was just one of many sort of disturbing signals. And then I have worked with pro-democratic groups, or like I used to work at the International Republican Institute in Belarus, which is again like a very different beast of whatever the dynamics and partisan politics is happening in the U.S. But International Republican Institute and National NDI in their foreign support of opposition pro-democratic groups
they work very closely
in Eastern
together.
Europe. They work very closely, and what I saw was a value-driven sort of programmatic support. That's why I was working with them a couple of years before I became a think tanker.
Since the name National Democratic Institute has come up, full disclosure, my wife is the president of NDI.
So I knew, I'm sorry, I just wanted to say that I worked with some pro-democratic groups.
And other people who worked with pro-democratic groups were suddenly getting arrested.
Exactly. And then I worked as a think tanker, and then I could see some people from think tanks arrested. And I knew that we were monitored. Even if no one would approach us before, I knew that some of my colleagues, economists, experts on, Belarusian domestic politics, some of them were approached at a certain point by KGB guys, and they would have a friendly conversation or a friendly reminder.
On the shoulder.
Exactly. You just watch what you're doing. We're not targeting you at the moment. And I was kind of waiting for this moment to when someone's going to approach me. And just to bring another example, one of political scientist whom I admire, Lawfare Editor-in-Chief, and I learned a lot from him. He was among the founders also of the pro-democratic political group, Movement for Freedom. So he was doing okay. No one approached him. No one was causing troubles for him. Up to the point, and he was conducting, he was also he's very good in teaching, and he was teaching a class on EU-Belarus relations. That's where I learned a lot, back in the days when I was in school. And then, so he did not have any troubles up until the point he registered to run for, I think, parliamentary elections. And then when he was just walking out of his house, police detained him. And he was beaten up to the point he got concussion. And all of this was happening in front of his kids who are minors, right? So I just knew all this crazy dynamics that, no one has told me I'm in trouble yet. But I knew that, this is the range of possibilities.
And did you think did you feel like you were being paranoid? Because nothing had happened, right? And so part of you must have been saying, am I going crazy?
Yes. And just every time when I tell myself, okay, maybe I'm just paranoid, then something comes up that maybe proves otherwise. And at the time of before the violence at during the election days, foreign colleagues from some like foreign institutions travel to Belarus just to see how it feels like on the ground, like what are the moods in the society, because they research Eastern Europe. And we were just having a chat in a cafe, and I thought like, and we both like we're talking about like, oh, it looks kind of peaceful, like no troubles, no signs of troubles yet in this presidential campaign. And then they got a call from their colleague detained at Minsk airport. So it looks, and what this colleague found out is that the authorities or KGB knew that he's coming to visit Belarus. They were looking for him. And apparently they kind of read his analysis already. They knew his work abroad. So they were not happy to see him coming to visit Belarus. They searched his phone, and then among other contacts, they saw my name, and they interrogated him, like, why are you meeting with political analyst, Katsiaryna? What did she tell you? Like, what is the purpose of the meeting, right? So I thought, like, okay, that's just another signal that things are just under, like, surveillance. That's disturbing.
Yeah, that certainly counts as disturbing. Okay, so you decide to leave. And then you left in a hurry.
Yes.
Tell me about the circumstances of your departure.
Well, I don't have much proofs, right, that I was in trouble, but I saw
like you don't have a lot of evidence that you're in trouble.
Yeah.
But you leave.
But I still chose to sleep a couple of nights. I was just sleeping in in actual clothes, not even pajamas, thinking that, okay, if someone breaks into my house and they drag me to prison, at least I will have clothes. Like, I won't be there in pajama, barefoot type of thing. Because this sort of happened to this Stas Garelik, PhD, former PhD student at George Washington, right, who was in Belarus just on vacation. Or there was the arrest of a political consultant, Vitaly Shklarov, who is now a U.S. Citizen, and he worked for Obama campaign. He was not arrested. No one decided to break into his house, but he went to local farmers market to buy some watermelons. That's when he was arrested and dragged into KGB prison. So there was already surveillance in place towards certain people. And again, I knew okay, I'm more or less in this circle. I'm in this crowd, so I could be next.
So how did you leave? I mean, there's no better way to present yourself as, dissident over here than to make for the border in a hurry.
I didn't actually plan to leave. My idea was to maybe stay in a friend's house, maybe in the countryside, not to stay at the actual address where I live in Minsk. But I think the final sort of decision was made when I took an Uber, which is in Belarus is run by Yandex Taxi. And it's a Russian service for taxi. And the taxi driver, I've never met such driver before in my life, before or after. The questions he was asking, he canceled the trip right away. He said oh, you'll pay me in cash. And again, it never occurred, even if a driver wanted to make extra cash, there was a lot of things that were looked off in that conversation. He was asking me where I'm going, who is meeting me at the place where I'm going, how many people are going to be there at that location, when I'm coming back, why I'm leaving town at this time. And the tone of the conversation, again, it was very, something was off. And I talked to journalists and human rights defenders who sort of confirmed to me that KGB has access to taxi databases. And I think if someone was monitoring my activities, for them, maybe it kind of stood apart that I didn't get out of my house very often because I was mostly staying at home. I didn't use my mobile phone as sort of, again, as some precautionary measure. And I think my work at the time was quite visible because there was internet blockage. That's, again, like a very common practice that the government does on the days of like the most important like political events. And I was commenting, like I wrote a piece for Guardian, I was commenting for Euronews. So my analysis, I still managed to, like when the internet was restored, internet connection was restored, like I would publish my analysis right away, and I would assume that was kind of visible.
All right. So when did you leave?
So after that Uber ride, unforgettable Uber ride, I booked the next available flight, and I left the next like early morning, and I was staying at someone else's house, and I asked like, based on that taxi experience, I then asked a friend like to call a taxi for me to the airport. And my idea was either they let me out of the country, or if I'm detained at the airport, at least that would be on my terms, meaning that I'm no longer waiting for someone to chase me.
So at least you've defined the circumstances.
Yeah, exactly.
And you weren't detained at the airport.
I was not. And again, like this is just my speculation. I think what helped was maybe there was like some time frame for, at that time, I think their logic of the KGB guys was let the dissidents or those nasty like fifth column folks just to flee rather than stay in the country and cause trouble. But also what could have helped was that I just had one carry-on bag because I didn't have – that was a very abrupt decision to leave. I just grabbed like bare necessities with me, and I had a return ticket in 5 days. So – and it was part of the plan to look as if I'm not leaving. I'm going on a trip, on a work trip, and I'm coming back. So I think all of the circumstances could have worked in my advantage.
But you didn't come back. What have you been doing since?
Yeah, so maybe like I would add like maybe a little more context to this, I don't know, crazy speculations of like me just having my paranoia and stuff. So literally a couple of months later, journalists, human rights defenders were detained at the airport, either at the attempt to leave the country or at the or when they come back from a trip abroad. And then I was recently asked, like, when did you feel safe when you left? Was it at the border control when the plane took off? Like, what was the point? I remember I fled to Kiev at the time in 2020, so it was safe and beautiful place to be. And I remember having paranoia right after I passed the border check, at the airport in Minsk, or when the plane did not take off, was preparing for takeoff. And then a year later, it sort of starts to make these concerns start to make sense because of the Ryanair plane interception accident. And that's when Belarusian and pretty much Russian special forces, they tracked down a Belarusian blogger, Roman Protasevich. He lived he was safe. I mean, he thought he was safe living in European Union at the time. He was based in Lithuania, and he was traveling to Greece for vacation. On the way back from Greece to Lithuania, the plane he was on, where
they forced the plane down.
Because the plane was in the Belarusian airspace for a short period of time, and they seized the opportunity. So again, like in the retrospect, I think like, okay, like my crazy concerns kind of make sense.
Well, and then ultimately your crazy concerns were validated by the fact that they indicted you and charged you.
Finally, I have some proof.
Right. So how did you find out about, I mean, your lawyers don't talk to you.
Yes.
How did you find out that you had been indicted?
A friend forwarded me a Telegram message from the Telegram channel of Belarusian Investigative Committee. And there was like a mugshot of me.
Really?
Yeah, like a mugshot. I mean, like a mugshot, like the picture from my old passport picture, like 10-year-old picture. I mean, like from 10 years old picture of me. It's like, oh, here's the analyst sort of charged with his charges. And she's ordered to I don't know, like to turn herself in to like Minsk, I don't know what, police department or whatever.
So are you going to?
Oh, no, like that was back in January.
And you didn't turn yourself in?
No, of course not.
Okay, just checking.
How surprising. But again, like on top of that, I was receiving some sort of warnings from some diaspora folks, like Belarusian diaspora, saying like, oh, we got some insider information. By the way, you're on the blacklist in Belarusian embassies abroad. Should you ever try to contact them? And you're on the detention list at the Belarusian border. But again, like there was no official charges.
Right, so
like,
you can feel crazy.
yeah. Yes.
Now the charges
Now
come.
I feel, if anything, I feel relief. Yes.
You are also wanted by the Russians.
Russia, yeah.
Why? What have you done to the Russian Federation?
I don't know. I think I said enough to that Russians could figure out, like the Kremlin folks could figure out that I don't quite like them.
I see.
I mean, I wrote quite a few reports on Russian disinformation efforts in Belarus, or I spoke on the U.S. Helsinki Commission right before the Russian full attack on Ukraine, or is commenting on Putin's moves. So I think I said enough to look bad.
And where is your trial now? So I know there was a hearing the other day. Before right around when you wrote your article in Lawfare. When do you find out whether you're going to be convicted?
No one knows. So the first trial was May 31st. The second, I think, June 21st. But we're actually expecting that there would be, like a court would decide something. Because it doesn't make sense. Like none of the defendants are in the country. We don't get any news. Like what's the point? Like if everything is sort of orchestrated, like all the, like, I mean, it's not that there's actual hearing or the lawyers would present some evidence that would help to acquit us or anything. So, funny enough, there's the third trial, hearing scheduled on July 1st. So, really hope that that's the time when they would at least announce some sentence.
Are you looking forward to being sentenced?
I don't know. Maybe I will be acquitted. That would be like a bummer to my personal image because, I mean, it would raise some suspicions.
Yeah, right. Before I want to close with some of the stuff that you're doing now, but how did you end up in the United States? You were in Kiev at first. You were in Lithuania for a while.
Yes. I was consulting the Belarusian democratic opposition in exile and continued my research work. I did some visiting fellowships in Germany, Czech Republic, and then I enrolled into a PhD at Virginia Tech. That's how I ended up here in D.C. But I've already had, like, I already lived in the U.S. for a couple of years before that, where I got my master's here. I worked here at the American Bar Association. So it was just, like, I already had a sense of what think tank life, or in general, what's the life feels like in D.C. And I felt like, oh, that's a good place to be to do the foreign policy analysis stuff, right?
And so you have an asylum application pending.
Yeah.
I would think that your case would be, it's almost like the textbook definition of asylum. You're literally on trial for political crimes, alleged phony political crimes.
I worked with the evil Americans
by a repressive foreign government. What do we know about the status of your asylum application?
I was overthinking my asylum application, and I always thought that it was like the last resort, like the desperation move, sort of. And I did my best for the past couple of years. I was living on this like short-term visas, renewing the visas, and using my amazing Belarusian passport. But when I saw that, okay, I know that the investigators in Belarus are after me, and it just doesn't sound well. So I thought, okay, maybe it's time to look for some more solid immigration documents. And what the Belarusian government is doing sometimes, they tend to target their opponents via Interpol. And it's not that there are no extradition cases by Interpol yet, and I don't think it's gonna happen. But typically, what happens, you're put in prison, in detention for a couple of months. No one's gonna get you back those months, right? And then I was very careful with my travel plans when I was in Europe. I chose not to travel anywhere outside of EU at the time. Knowing the Ryanair case, right now there is a extradition case pending in Serbia against the Belarusian movie maker who was again outspoken critic of the regime. Serbia actually is about to decided to extradite him to Belarus, which is very disturbing. And again, I just knew a bunch of those stories, so I was extra careful. And in the end, I decided, okay, time to proceed with asylum application, probably.
While that is pending, you've started a podcast.
Yes.
Tell us about your podcast.
Oh, so I'm having fun. I'm running a podcast together with Darth Putin KGB. This is a Twitter persona.
Yes. So for those who do not know Darth's Twitter persona, this is an anonymous satire account that pretends to be Vladimir Putin, but is also a real Russia analyst in his own comic sort of way. Is that a fair description?
Yes.
And so you and he teamed up. You're the named host, and he's the pseudonymous host.
I could only imagine how it could attract at some point attention of, again, the Kremlin folks who see their boss being mocked at, and I'm the
yeah, but you're the one who's got political repression.
Right? Yes.
He's whoever the hell he is.
Yeah.
What are your long-term plans? You're here. Your work visa will come through at some point.
Work authorization, it's no longer a visa, hopefully.
Right, and your asylum
I'm so done with living on visas.
And your asylum claim will come through at some point. What's the future? What is your future criminal enterprise here?
I want to be part of think tank community here, because that's literally I live and breathe politics. And I just want to write and speak about things that I think matter in terms of international relations and security.
You will be the first, I think, convicted felon, assuming you are convicted, to be a big part of the. There have actually been a couple others, but look, what is the podcast called for people who want to?
In the Bunker with Darth Putin, and we're an Apple podcast.
And where can people find you on various socials?
I'm on Twitter mostly, I think. I don't write anywhere else, mostly on Twitter.
And what's your Twitter handle for those who want to look you up?
It's K Shmatsina. We'll leave that.
All right, we will leave that, and we will put that in the show notes. Katya, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
You can find Katya's article about her ongoing trial on Lawfare. It is cheekily entitled "Watching My Trial for Seditious Conspiracy."
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter through our website at lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath. our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Also be sure to check out our written work at lawfaremedia.org. This podcast is edited by Jen Patja, and your audio engineer this episode was Kara Schillen of Goat Rodeo. Our theme song is from Alibi Music. As always,